And we're live.
All right. Uh, I, I I have to stop myself whenever I'm in a position where I'm moderating. I really have this great tendency to want to say, "This morning, welcome," and you go, "No, we're talking about a global audience here." My name is Kurt Cagle. I am the editor of the Cagle Report, which is uh, a set of newsletters and other related commentary on LinkedIn on the areas of artificial intelligence, knowledge graphs, data modeling, and in general, the evolution of knowledge systems. Um, we are here today to talk specifically about the issue of data and AI governance. Now, a little bit of an introduction here. Governance has always had something of a bad taste for many organizations. The person who was basically your data governance person was always kind of both feared and hated within the organization in general because it was essentially kind of a bottleneck um, by which everyone else looked at that person and looked at that role and said, this person basically just wants to control everything. And so they were very seldom liked. Um, However, that has changed, and it has changed largely because of the very nature of data and increasingly the intelligence that that data carries with it in terms of how it helps to organize an organization, how it helps to produce products, how it helps to ensure communication to the outside world. In many respects, that ability to be able to say, is the information that I am working with here something that is critical to the organization, to our mission, in such a way as to make it worthwhile to bring into the system. And so, increasingly, the role of the AI governor is as much an architectural role and a strategic role as it is a curational role. Someone who basically says, you can have that, no, you can't have that, and let me talk to my lawyers. So, our discussion today is actually going to be talking with a number of leaders in the industry who are all working in the boundaries of AI governance specifically, but to a certain extent, data governance as part of a broader effort of that. So let me kind of start working around on this. We are going to go in alphabetical order, starting with uh, uh, Dorian here. So by first name, take it away, Dorian. Give me
Actually,
an
maybe.
introduction of yourself and
Hi, I'm sure. I'm Dorian Cougias. I'm the co-founder of Unified Compliance, as it says there on my little title. I just gave a wonderful prezzo, if I say so myself, on regulations and around AI globally. Um, I'm uh, I'm working with a lot of organizations, Unified Compliance, Reg Genome, grcschema.org, on how to ensure that AI regulatory compliance is something that becomes actionable in your organization and accountable in your organization.
all right, Jabin.
Thank you, Dorian. Thank you, Kurt. So myself, Jabin, I'm part of TCS BFSI Capital Market Solution Architecture. What we do for our clients is my special focus is on modernizing the legacy systems and how we can enable AI as an enabler to to bring the transformative impact. And currently, I'm working on my own platform to create sustainability as a service for the organizations because that is also something in the focus across the industry landscape. Apart from that, there is something interesting. The governance part is something which is always evolving around what is right, what is wrong, what is biased, unbiased, and those are the focus points for me as well. So looking forward for the conversation in this panel. Thank you.
Joaquin.
Hey, my name's Joaquin. I'm the founder of the Swarm community, and this is the first year, the first anniversary event, I guess. I've been hosting these events since November of last year, and yeah, my intent has been to bring together all sorts of different minds from different angles to drive discussions around the responsible adoption of AI, particularly around ESG. So happy to be here as a panelist.
Tech.
Hi, I'm Tech, and I'm a founder of Care Nepal, a research organization in Nepal which conducts research in the area of artificial intelligence, particularly responsible artificial intelligence. So, how do we make sure that AI can be trusted, is accountable, and can be relied upon? I'm also a postdoc at MIT, where I'm researching uh, again use of knowledge graph and large language models to in the neuroscience domain to ensure that whatever we produce as an output can be relied upon. Previously, I was working on GDPR, building tools, and also understanding the implications of GDPR and how to develop technical solutions. Happy to be here as a panelist.
I'm happy to have you. So with that, I'm going to actually open this up with a relatively simple question. How do you basically define data governance and the role of the people that basically are acting as data governors? And specifically, I'd like you to talk about it first in a larger data context, and then I want to kind of narrow that down a little bit into what do we mean by AI or artificial intelligence governance. So, Dorian, why don't you start out, and we'll kind of take it from there.
Oh wow, data governance is very, very large. Data governance begins with what can you do? What are you allowed to do with data? And in the AI space, when you're talking data governance with people, you're talking about, okay, they're going to read something, they're going to interact with something, they're going to do something, they're going to build documents. They can read a term of service. They can read a license and say, this is what we can do with it. They can read Pipito or get a briefing, right? Go to a class. With AI, you have to do it as a very, very different format. I'm gonna share my screen really, really quick.
Please.
Window. I'm going to share this window because then I'm going to go over to this tab. Can you guys see my tab?
Momentarily. There we go.
All right. This is a thing that we're building. It's very, very ugly right now, but it will also be explainable AI. If I type in unifiedcompliance.com, what it did is it went out and it looked at a bunch of contents. Is there a AI? Is there a terms? Are there licenses? Are there robot text out there saying you can't do this? Are there any other explicit things within the content saying, hey, I don't like what's going on? And then you can also, review any analysis and help them improve. Okay. Now, what happens if I go and put somebody restrictive in? Try to copy and paste over here. Oh, come on. Of course, I'm giving a demo and it does that.
Break. You know that.
There we go. Now, this one is very restrictive. Look at this risk level, 100%. It's critical. Why? Because it says in here, AI bot access restricted. Also, we found 4 prohibitions. We detected critical severity items because what they did on their website, if you go and read it, it says, if you use AI to analyze any content from ISA, we are going to sue you. They literally say, we are going to sue you. All right. So stop cam. There we go.
Thank you.
Data governance begins in the AI universe. Stop sharing. There we go. Come on. There we go. AI data governance begins in the AI universe with rules and regulations beginning at the text and data mining. Then what can you do with derivations? Then what can you do with transformations? And then what can you do with derivations and or transformations that you transfer outside of your organization? Okay, and it has to be done in a federated manner, because there's where the data comes from. We have to protect where the data comes from. It's where the data then is going to be put into the RAG of where you're going to use it for manipulation inside your organization, and then where that derivated or transformed data is going to go, either inside your organization or outside your organization, with policies, procedures, and or content that you share with people. So data governance in this new world of AI is a federated data governance environment, which means then that you're going to have an international participation of people on what you can and cannot do with that data at every step of the way. And I hope that answers the question.
That's a very good answer. I liked it a lot. Jabin, any comments?
Sure. I mean, Dorian has touched upon very critical, one of the most critical factors what organizations are not actually doing. Okay, and this is a very focal point for us. What Dorian just now brought it up, like the website privacy or the creation of IPs, for example. What is protected, what is not protected, what am I giving access? Because right now with the heavy usage of AI, it's kind of people are using it, but consciously how much ethical usage of AI is in place? Can we say it at one point? No, we are not at that point. Can the enterprises say? Can the, as a consumers we can say? So the way what Dorian just now showed, that was just one beautiful example of a compliance check. Okay, how we can protect our real IP assets when it comes to the organization with their own trade secrets, their own content. We cannot violate contents, and we have to respect geographical and geographies, multi-geographies, multi-diverse culture. So lot of picture into the play. And apart from that, the regulations from a EU Union perspective, from a Japanese point of Japanese country as in Japan, they have enforced their own AI regulations. US is still working on it. So we definitely have to bring all these regulations and working or have something at a governance level, what is permitted, not permitted. So I'm just explaining the context around Dorian because there is, I mean, he already very beautifully explained. It all boils down to one thing. Within my organization, what I am permitting to my users at what level, and externally, my data is talking to other systems. What am I allowing to the in and out? What comes in, what goes out, everything within the ethical boundaries that I am setting. And in terms of AI into the play, yes, like I cannot give my system to some AI to read it and just feed it and use the logic to how we are deriving our strategy or consumers or new LOVs, etc. We cannot do that. So that is something definitely we need to start working on it, and we need to work on the similar systems what Dorian is doing, or create or work with the third party organizations which are heavily focused on security, AI, and governance, how to inbuild. And that is what I would say for the enterprises. I think. Sorry, I mean, so Kurt, there is one limitation from my end is that if you ask me to talk upon something, my attention span is like it will revolve around. I may speak over the length. So yeah, so switching over to you.
I will switch you if there's an issue, but I think what you were saying was absolutely on the mark. So fantastic. Um, Tech, let me get your feedback on that. What do you see as both the role of the data governance manager, and I'm not really sure actually if there's a specific role. When we talk about data governance manager, we talk about a data governor. It's a really ambiguous term to begin with. But I'm kind of curious, what's your take about all of this specifically with regard to how we're thinking about it and its integration with AI?
Okay, and it's a great question, and what Dorian has touched upon is more or less giving big picture of the data governance. But how I'd like to add few more things. How I see is when we talk about data governance and its relation with AI, we should first start with data, because almost everything lies in data.
Mhm.
Algorithms, AI, those comes after data, because if you don't have data, there's no AI algorithm that can be applied upon, and there's no issue of AI governance, because the primary issue that we are having now is because data contains some sensitive information that whatever AI algorithm is making use of it while it should not.
Yeah.
That's something I think we need to look into. And one thing that we should make sure is like, do I have permission? And that's what GDPR touched upon, right? For like taking consent, obtaining consent from the user or the data owner. The same thing, same kind of things we need to have. And how does it relate to AI? Once we have those data, let's say, even though it contains sensitive information, I am allowing you to use my data, then we come into AI governance, because I'm saying I'm okay with using my personally identifiable data, maybe some others as well, but then is AI algorithm that you are implementing is fair enough? Is in compliance with whatever regulatory compliance has established the guidance? That's my take on the data and AI governance. So the the main point is they cannot come individual; they should come together.
Mhm. I would agree with that. Joaquin, you tend to have a very broad view with all these talks that you've been giving, and all the excellent um, uh, presentations that you've been helping to moderate and set up. And again, thank you for that. Um, I'm curious, from your perspective going in, what are you seeing with regard to the definition of the role of the role within the organization, whether that organization is governmental, whether it's regulatory, whether it's something that basically is at a business or corporate level. How do you think that is changing with the presence of AI?
That's an expensive question.
It's
Let me
good.
see if I can break it down. Let me see if I can break it down. So, what is the implication of AI across this broad spectrum of
Excuse me.
organizational types? Is the question?
Yep.
Well, I think it depends. It depends is the key blanket answer. Depends on the resources. Depends on the talent, the experience, the skills that are available to implement these ideas. I think just the word AI itself is a broad umbrella term that applies to a lot of different technology groups. I know just in this panel, we have representation in machine learning and deep learning and knowledge graphs and all sorts of derivatives of those technologies and a variety of use case implementations. Um, so I think it all boils down to um, there is this obfuscation of meaning in these technologies, and there is an unclear view into what this is capable of providing in an organization. But I think that there's a huge gap in understanding that an organization really is a set of actors trying to accomplish a goal, not it's not just an entity that's grabbing onto tools and magnifying their capabilities. It boils down to the individuals in an organization that need to be able to adopt these ideas. I don't know if that answers it at all, or if I went down completely wrong angle.
I think that it's a good answer. I mean, it's a deliberately kind of vague question. Um, so let me kind of switch gears a little bit. One of the things that you see a lot in the news lately, and especially if you're, an omnivore like me, who's probably spends too many hours reading about what's going on in the sector and who's talking and what the latest speeches are and so forth. We're at an interesting crossroads where the concept of intellectual property and the concept of data are essentially colliding with one another. And that presents a very, very unique challenge. I think it's something that we really haven't had to address to any great extent before. But we're now in a situation, in a struggle in many respects, with regard to the question of who owns the data. What do you mean by ownership? What do you mean when you talk about training? Is that something where you're actually taking content with or without permissions? Who basically gives those permissions? There's a lot of fundamental questions that we are now answering or having to answer. And, it's something that impacts the development of this system, of this sector very significantly, because each of those things ultimately really kind of comes down to effectively how much control does any given organization or entity have on intellectual property, whether it is the products of data or of data transformations or data processes, whether it is the intellectual development of creative content, whether it is media of various and sundry sorts, analyses, even the nature of, who exactly owns the internet and the information that's contained thereof, and under what license or types of license does that operate? So there's a lot that comes out of that. I'm kind of curious to hear from all of you about this fundamental question. What is going to be the role of governance in essentially helping to untangle that Gordian knot of essentially who has access to, who owns, who works with, who benefits from the data that is out there, that drives the AIs, that informs the knowledge graphs, that does things like that. And what is the role of the data governance officer in an organization at any level in terms of being able to ensure that those boundaries get respected? So let me kind of go back in order that I had originally. Dorian, let me start with you on that.
All right, I'm sharing a screen again, I hope.
Yep, there you go.
There you go. So this is a thing I put together for some of the lawyers. It's like, who owns what? All right. So original work or a compiled database is owned by the person who created it. It's protected by copyrights and license. The arranged data elements are protected by copyrights and license. What's protected by fair use doctrine is the individual data elements. One of the things that I was bringing this up to the EU people the other day is that if I tokenize content, the individual tokenization of that content, or the corpora of tokenized data, or the LLM under there, is currently protected by fair use doctrine. Once I can get that data, once I can have it. But the NLP tag text, i.e. when it is pulled back out for something and or a trained data model, is then re-protected by the original copyright. But if I transform that work or I derive that work, the generative content right now is in gray area, and then transformative work is now owned by the way, the AI consumer. So if it is truly transformative right now, nobody is debating that truly transformative work is owned by the person that does it, as long as it is 35% created, manipulated by a person. If it is all created, manipulated by AI, AI doesn't own it, because machines in any world, view cannot own anything. And so who owns it? This going back to what Tech said, going and Jabin said earlier, it's going back to the data of it. It's going back to the privacy of it. It's going back to what's going on. And then who has rule of law protection? Right now, if a consumer came in and worked with real and really did help transform it, the new consumer owns the transformative work, and it all begins again. But there's gray area in there. There's fair use doctrine in there, and then there's original protections and copyrights that Japan, that EU are holding. NLP tag text is still owned by the original creator. The trained data model, believe it or not, is still owned in every rule that's come out by the original creator. Do organizations even know that? Do the data officers in those organizations know that they're dealing with content owned by somebody who created it, or by somebody, as Tech was pointing out, somebody it is their data because it's about them. If you're doing data modeling about your consumers, about where they go or what they do, or any of their personality things or anything else that is individually identifiable, whether that's NLP tagged or not, that's still owned by that person. That person has rights over that data, whether it's in a trained model or not.
Yep.
And that's pretty clear.
Okay. So, by the way, feel free to jump in. You don't have to wait for me to point at you and say do this. So
Yeah,
Tech, why don't you go on next?
yeah. I agree with what Dorian said. For example, in the case of there are gray areas, and I think there needs to be discussion because what is the main thought is like who should be benefiting. I would say everyone should be benefiting. It's not just company, because if I am sharing my data, means I should also be benefited out of that. Why? Because without my data, whatever that company X is achieving, that wouldn't have been possible. So if just one way, I think there will always be debate, and people. It's like going to the old days where authoritarian rule, where they take benefit of everything and make people work, and without giving them any benefits. It's like the same thing, but in a technological manner. Like it's the modern way, more modern authoritarian way, I would say. And
We become data serfs.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
that should not be the case, because all of these
Okay.
technologies that we have been developing, it's for our benefit. So it's not that one person or other should benefit.
Okay. So, Jabin, Joaquin, do either of you have comments on that?
Sure. So, Joaquin, let me just go over. I just wanted to resurface on what Dorian pointed out. So, one is from the context, like how we can ensure that a data governance officer or an elevated role can play a role in terms of creating that strategy. What can we protect? What we cannot protect? What are we allowing? What are we not allowing? Apart from that, I do see one more key responsibility, which we could say it's an elevated responsibility when we are talking in the age of AI. We already have a master data governance specialist in the organization. So, who are the fundamental stewardship holders of what data policies, what data controls, what quality of data we should have, what is the primitive data, what is transaction? So, I think we need to elevate this master data governance role to a AI data governance kind of strategic role where we can bring in both the concepts of what Dorian mentioned and re-policy making of creating the standards. And I'm sorry, I do have a question to Dorian. Where was that 35% you just came up with that? Like where we can set the boundary that okay, the transformative rights go to the consumer. So where did you arrive at that? That was I'm just being curious. Sorry if I missed to read it, if it's a standard protocol or something.
So if you go up to ResearchGate and look under my name, there's a whole bibliography of where that came from, and there's a paper up there. I'm now going to look up because I don't memorize these things. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, when you write a bunch of these things, it's
Well, Dorian,
yeah, you're gonna have to give me a minute.
yeah,
Here we
look,
go. Data protections and licenses affecting text and data mining for machine learning. And then there's another one up there. It's the current legal climate concerning. No, it's version 3 of something or another. I'll have to find it in a sec.
yeah, I think one thing
AI
that
governance and frameworks version 3. They're both up at ResearchGate.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Dorian. No, just being curious, wanted to read it and get more context around it because you have touched upon the like very, very key point there. Okay. Thank you.
yeah, one thing I was saying, I'd like to add, touching on to Jabin's like saying, like drafting policies and things. I would say we have good policies. It's out there. Some we need to make improvement. It's always the case. But what I see missing is the enforcement.
Hmm.
I think it's not just on paper. It should also be enforced. Otherwise, it would be always on paper. We'll be talking and we'll reach nowhere. I think that's the one of the important thing, like collective, we're working towards implementation and enforcing.
To that particular end, I noticed an announcement by the U.S. Copyright Office that they were currently about, I'm wanting to say about 4 months into what they expect to have as a 6 to 7 month project, specifically talking about guidelines for copyright principles in the age of AI. And I think that one of the key things, so sometime around the beginning of next year, one of the key things that really kind of comes out down to this, and I think, Tech, you're exactly right, is before you can have enforcement, you do essentially have to have guidance. You have to have a mechanism to be able to say, this is basically what we mean by X, Y, and Z. And to a certain extent, I think that a lot of what Dorian's working on, a lot of what I'm seeing with other organizations now, is in essence trying to be able to pin down terminology, to be able to pin down essentially what enforcement actions are available to be able to do that, and that in turn is going to effectively impact in the U.S. in particular, but it no doubt will hold true in all of these jurisdictions. It will impact essentially what specifically various judicial offices, judges, courts, so forth, um, can effectively levy as enforcement. And that's a problem right now because it's still the Wild West. We still have a lot of actors out there who are at least making the claim of fair use and with regard to the content, which probably is not fully legitimate. But because the terminology, because the um, you know, because we're essentially now in a process of trying to define and clarify what we actually mean by copyright protections, fair use, things like that in an increasingly digital environment where you're talking about the production of products as artifacts as that are essentially generated as part of the process. That then really kind of comes down to a lot of questions that are pretty deep. What is art? That's actually a profound question that I've been talking about with a number of different entities and organizations. Because if you don't have a definition for what is art, then talking about intellectual property makes no sense. And the definition for what is art seems to be increasingly it is something that is not by itself produced by a machine. It is something that is essentially an iterative process whereby a human being potentially working with the machine is able to refine ideas and generate from those ideas some kind of a perhaps evolving set of products. And it's not really the product anymore so much as it is the evolutionary process that actually defines the characteristics of art. That's why you can't necessarily go and say, hey, I've got a list, or I've got a data set that contains all of my here's all of the transactions that were completed by my accounting system. Is that art? No, it probably isn't, because it's not an iterative process. It's not a process of continued refinement. It is data. And all art ultimately, as we're beginning to understand, is data in some manner. It is essentially an artifact of a process that has been refined by human perception and human discernment to be able to then present something. And this is where things get a little fuzzy, in that I know my definition that I've used in a lot of these discussions is it's something that is intended to evoke an emotion or some kind of a response from a human audience. And that's where things get really, really, you're almost off the tracks there when it comes from a business standpoint. But increasingly, that is the characteristic that you see with a lot of the IP discussions. And this has relevance right now because not only do you have questions like, what's going on with OpenAI and other organizations that are basically scraping the web, but also, you're now looking at media production, video production, or gen video, as I call it, where you're essentially creating, video content dynamically based upon multiple levels of feedback. And companies like Disney are now getting into the act and saying, we're building our own AI studio. And this kind of comes back to all of this, because it says to me that those organizations that have been traditionally oriented towards the production of media, and in many respects, that's really where the value is in terms of intellectual property, are now effectively putting a stake into the ground. That in turn gets back into the larger international ramifications, where you effectively are saying, what is it that these countries and organizations, super countries, are essentially trying to protect? And a lot of it really kind of comes down to, what are the ideas, the intellectual properties, the visual media, or oral media, so forth, that are intrinsic to that country's organization and economy, or to culture and economy. Those are essentially some of the crown jewels that you're talking about. Talking about data and data protection, yes, that's important, but it's also important with regard to ideas, concepts, visualizations, things that essentially say, I am human. So sorry to get on my own rant, but I thought that was very relevant to the broader question. How that applies to data governance, that's a really thorny question.
This is a problem that is as old as brick making or tile making. I think back in the day, they used to make tiles, and the groups of people, the organizations that used to make tiles, used to put their family seal or stamp of origination or manufacturing seal to show that there's a level of quality that is to be expected with the manufacturing of a certain brick or tile in that particular area. But that has never stopped counterfeiters from coming in and taking inferior tile and marking a similar derivative of that seal. So
Trademarks. Yeah.
Is that the same argument that we're trying to come up with?
I think it's actually very, very similar. I mean, this gets back to something that Dorian mentioned in our previous talk, which was talking about XBRL. And XBRL is important, and I know a lot of people. I've done a fair amount of work in the XBRL community myself. But the role of XBRL is not just to account for the exchange of money. It's also basically to track valuable assets. And that question of who originated that asset, and if it's decomposed and then recomposed into some other form, how much that percentage of that asset or the aspects of the asset that went into that essentially then become part of the overall process. And by extension, how much of that initial data that you're utilizing for things like AI and the AI model is the technology, and how much of it ultimately is the inputs. And I think that's, again, one of those big areas where we talk about AI governance, that you're basically having to weigh those to be able to determine, at what extent, do you compensate or have to compensate for the utilization of these things, because they're not necessarily the same. What you put in, it may or may not actually be directly attributable, but at the same time, the owners of that content do factor into the production that comes out of that.
Well, yeah, I want to add to that because it's very, very interesting. I'm working on a project right now with unified compliance and Reg Genome out of Cambridge, and one of the things we're realizing is that of all of the issuers of regulatory guidelines around the world, some places, even in the United States, like Georgia says, we created these laws. You can consume them people-wise for purposes of following the laws. However, we reserve the right to derive and transform our content by machine learning for any purpose without financial remuneration.
Yep.
In other words, pay us, damn it. And working with the guys at Red Genome, I said, and so I've got this. Matter of fact, one of the papers up at ResearchGate shows all the states and all the territories of where you can text and data mine for free because it has open regulatory guidelines, and which ones you have to go check and which ones say no, screw that. Worldwide, when talking to the Reg Genome guys, because they're global and I'm US over here at Unified Compliance, there are probably 200 to 300 regulators saying the same thing as the state of Georgia, that if you're going to go and do something with this, if you're going to, like LexisNexis gets stuff free, Westlaw gets stuff free right now from these guys. Well, Europe is going, in the age of AI, we should be making money on the derivation and transformation of our content. Let's now write that into guidelines. So more and more people are going to say, it's not just what I created that I own. I want to reserve payment rights for that which you're going to create from that which I created. Because machines can now very easily pick up and derivate and transform. And I think we're going to see more and more of that to bring up the points that you guys were talking about.
There are startups that are focusing exclusively on intellectual property of the likeness of individuals and those kinds of derivatives as well. I know movie stars and pop stars and musicians, they have to sign away certain properties when they engage in their business dealings in association with a studio.
Sure.
So now a studio can say, all right, now I can spin up a 3D holographic version of Dorian or Kurtz and have them
God
sing,
forbid.
"Gangster's Paradise" if I wanted to. But yeah, it
which
is
was
interesting.
Well, wasn't
what
that the reason for the big writer's strike?
it was. It was that both the writers' strike and SAG,
Yeah,
um,
that's what I thought.
for precisely that reason. In fact, it wasn't so much a matter of, yeah, there were wage and compensation discussions, but the meat of that strike, and it's echoing elsewhere. It has become essentially a question of what rights do we have as actors, as writers, as producers of content. I mean, granted, you're also seeing those boundaries kind of shift and move and thing. My favorite example is um, the Scarlett Johansson um, made a really major fuss about the use of her voice by
Right,
OpenAI,
right.
when they produced it and said, look, that's my property, and this notion that we're now having of essentially saying, do we own our own likenesses? Do we own our own biometric characteristics? And again, this comes back down to, if the answer is no, then essentially you have what amounts to a form of serfdom.
Right.
And so, that the question then becomes, what is it worth? And this to me is, I think, a big part of the discussion we're having now. Everyone is now starting to say, oh, this is something that has value, and we need to determine a market or a mechanism for assessing what that value is and how it changes over time.
It was
And I think that's part of what's actually going back into the regulatory side of things, because they're looking at that and saying, okay, this ultimately comes down to that question of what is value and who benefits, cui bono.
Yeah, I think it goes back to my earlier point. Like, it's not like it's not just one entity that should be benefiting, but everyone. If I am providing, I think we boil down to things like who is benefiting, how, and to what extent.
Exactly.
Also, the other point that I'd like to bring is like when we talk about all those guidelines, data, AI governance, we should also have to think from the multi-jurisdiction perspective. For example, there's a law in like US or Europe has its own set of law, but how are they interplaying with different laws across the world? How
Hmm.
do we make sure that all of those align to some extent? Because if it's not, then what does it mean? Because that means that data governance to me is something different than to you if we look from the country perspective. I think that's also a bigger part of discussion because why is it important? Because if we for the time being forget about OpenAI, and if we just consider medical research, all those drug discovery that's happening, it's not happening just based on the data from US or Europe or whichever country in Asia. The data should come from all throughout the world so that the medicine, whatever that's being developed, is applicable to people across the world. So in
Yeah,
order to address that kind of problem, I think we need to go beyond a single country and look from the multi-jurisdiction perspective, both from the data and AI governance.
does this imply that we have to have some sort of global identify identity system for each individual person, and then we need to keep track of our
That would be very optimistic to say, but that's not possible.
They're not going to do that. They're not. Yeah, they don't even want to have
Yeah,
driver's
that's not
licenses for voting.
possible because each country has their own interest, and it will always be there, even without AI in every other thing. So we are not going to have that. Uh, so
Well, I suspect
think
that
from a
is
different
actually,
perspective to what extent we can align on key areas, right? I think that's already helpful. That would be already helpful if we could align to some extent and get uh, almost everyone involved.
yeah, the thing that I'm seeing on that, and did we lose? Yes, we did.
Jabin said he had a client call, so he had to drop 10
Okay,
minutes. Yeah.
all right. So the the issue, I mean, we're getting to that other third rail. There's a bunch of third rails around here. It's just kind of like you can't turn around without hitting a live wire somewhere. But the other aspect of this is exactly what Joaquin was talking about, and that is that at some point you get to a stage of needing to be able to identify an endpoint, identify a person, identify a thing. The downside to that is that by doing that, that is information that could potentially violate the privacy of those individuals. And because the other aspect of AI, and one we haven't really talked about but is increasingly out there, is the fact that you have what are amounting to inferential systems. And inferential systems basically mean, even though they're not great at it yet, that's changing. But inferential systems basically mean that I can identify an individual to a relatively high degree of probability based upon multiple characteristics and historical information and things like that. And that's not going to change. We're reaching a stage where it's largely irrelevant if a person has an identifier, because there are so many different ways of being able to infer that identity that it becomes largely a moot point.
You're
So,
absolutely right. Matter of fact, there are studies right now on that up at academia and other places
right.
that are saying, look, I can there was 100 different places to identify the same person and different ways to identify the same person that are highly accurate.
Yeah. So I think one example that I could add here is, for example, if we take the hospital, if you are first, we can narrow down from the geographic location. Let's say if there's someone having some kind of disease, you can get the hospital public record, you can match, and then you can do some localization with other data. You can know person, right? So yeah, it's a tricky world, I would say, because we, even us talking here, we have our data out there, so many. And if we today say, okay, I don't want to be identified, there people, they can already take what's out there, what we have put it out there, and already identify us. And
Yeah.
also from the other portals like social media, e-commerce website, they know more than we know ourselves, our behavioral pattern, right?
Yeah, and that I think is where, because the other role, taking us back to the whole notion of data governance, the other role is basically that of being a data privacy advocate or privacy officer. And that is to say that I have information within my system that, for one reason or another, should not be publicly seen, or should only be viewable by these people with these credentials and these ACLs.
Yeah, I would say the control of that should be with the data owner, or the whose data that is.
Yeah. The problem with that
Mhm.
is that the data owner is not necessarily the person about which the data
Yeah,
exists. It is basically the person who references that particular person, or that the business, the organization in general, that references that particular individual for a specific reason. And, we don't, the typical person does not own their medical records, because the medical records are basically records about a person by various different organizations. And if they're really good, they can network and share that information. But the structure that we have and the lack of legal structure at this point basically says that even if we have multiple pieces, there's nothing that specifically allows you to say the owner of this information is also the person about whom this information is specifically created. So the creator of the information is not always, and in many cases, not usually, going to be the owner of the content. And that's why we need to be very careful about that argument.
Yeah, I do agree with you. But if we consider from the personally identifiable data, specifically talking from the GDPR perspective, it says if it's my data, I am the owner. But I agree with you, it's not applied in all cases, and there are gray areas that people always exploit.
Yeah, and this kind of gets back to the whole notion of what is a personal identifier. Because in many respects, what happens is that you end up with a cloud of identifiers that surround a person. Each organization essentially is identifying them, and the danger that you have, or the concern that you have, is essentially once you can start being able to say this identifier, and this identifier essentially describe the same entity. At which point you're talking about a digital twin. That's the next stage in that evolution, is essentially saying I can now map all of these identifiers, and if I have access to these systems, then I can basically find out my evolution through school, through medical situations, through business, and so forth, just on the basis of that. And this is the fundamental challenge that everybody has, is that when we're talking about privacy, we have to look at that versus the analytical and inferential nature of artificial intelligence. Okay, we're at 3 minutes to the hour.
Yeah,
Any final thoughts?
I just want to
Not
say
to break this discussion short, because I think it's a fascinating one. But Joaquin,
it's clear to me why this is such a dark area to explore, and why it scrambles a lot of people's heads. It certainly scrambles my head every time I just inhale part of this discussion. There is the corporate organizational view, there is the multi-territory view, there is the individualistic view, and all these views sort of collide with each other, not not even taking into account the technical implementation or the ethical considerations around this. I mean, I think Dorian brought up a lot of good points as to how different countries value and weigh the decision-making matrix of how they create their ruling system and their governance system. So it's not an easy, straightforward answer. It depends who you ask, where you ask, and at what
And
level,
when?
and when, and their infrastructure. How are they capable of enforcing these ideas?
Dorian,
I'd,
I'm saying, go ahead, and we'll
sure. I'd say everyone should come together, work collectively, and we should treat data more than just a number.
okay, Dorian.
I have nothing else to add to all of this. It's an ongoing discussion that is going to become a more rapidly changing discussion as time goes on.
Yeah,
We're not going to solve this today or any time in the near future by any shape or means. And how we talk about it, who we talk about it with, and the speed with which we come to at least decisions for now at the definitional level will really help everybody.
Yeah, I would absolutely concur with that. I think the important thing here is not necessarily the decision we make, but the communication that we have with other stakeholders and other people, organizations, countries, global entities, whatever, that all are essentially part of that discussion.
Exactly.
And without that communication, without that ability to say, this is wrong, this is what ethics is all about. And from that to then say, this is effectively the constraint by which we are building a 21st, and don't even want to use the term artificial intelligence because I think it's broader than that, but the 21st century ethical and philosophical framework upon which we move forward. I think that is something that, in many respects, I think the data governance people and the regulatory people and the standards people are all trying more or less to get to be able to at least say these are the conduits for communication, so that when we do come up against these very hard ethical systems, we have ideas, frameworks, rules,
Guidelines. Yeah.
guidelines for helping us move forward. Well, it's now the top of the hour. I want to thank all of you, and as well as Jabin, who had to go a little bit early, for, I think, a very fascinating discussion. I think this has been very fruitful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you, Kurt. So we're going to be recording. We're going to finish buffering these conversations. You're going to be able to rewatch them in about 2 hours. So stay tuned. And tomorrow we have the second day. Be sure to show up for that one as well. Thank you, Kurt, also for moderating this panel. And yeah, we're signing off.